Hello everyone, my name is Britannia Simpson and I will be presenting on question 6a. It says that according to St.Thomas Aquinas, the sole purpose of sex is for procreation. With the use of philosophical arguments, support or reject Aquinas' notion of the sole purpose of sex. So class, what is the purpose of sex? What exactly is the purpose of sex? Is it to fulfill desires? Is it for religious obligations? Is it for intimacy? Is it a means of duty that one, once they are married or in a relationship, has to perform? Is it about socializing? Is it casual? Or is it merely for just procreation, or procreation is just a part of it? St. Thomas Aquinas is a very interesting philosopher who states that sex is for procreation, a primary good, and he mentioned that any act from which of its nature generation cannot follow is wrong. Aquinas therefore condemns masturbation, homosexual acts, and any act where the natural style of intercourse is not observed. He also have a problem with adultery because he says that it breaks the primary precepts of the natural law living in society. What exactly is natural law? Natural law theory is the most important philosophical defense of the traditional sexual practices. Its basic position is that the natural purpose of sex is reproduction, and non-natural sexual activity is morally wrong since it conflicts with that aim. Natural law as its main proponent, it states that God has implanted within human nature a set of instincts that define our purpose as human beings and establish what is morally right. We have, for example, a divinely implanted instinct to be sociable, and this tells us unsociable actions are wrong, such as murder and theft. We also have an instinct to care for our young, and this tells us that we are nurturers and that we are here to educate our children. Similarly, we have an instinct to procreate, yes, which tells us that we are to have sexual intercourse for the purpose of having children. For Aquinas, this rules out adultery, fornication, and homosexuality, each of which involves sexual relationships that are not for the purpose of procreation. Such sexual misconduct, according to Aquinas, is a serious sin, second only to murder, since while murder only destroys life, sexual misconduct basically thwarts or hinder the creation of life. Aquinas offers a very specific argument for his procreation only view of sex. Based on the natural purpose of the body parts, the various parts of our bodies have precise aim, he argues, and sex organs have the clear function of facilitating reproduction through sexual intercourse. To use our sex organ for purposes other than reproduction, that is a misuse of the body part. So too with natural purpose of semen. It is there for reproduction, and any emission of it without that purpose in mind is a sin against nature. Not only must human sexual activity aims at procreation, but according to Aquinas, it must also be done within the context of a monogamous marriage Men have a natural desire to be sure that their children really are theirs, which would not be possible if couples were uncommitted. Also, polygamous marriages are wrong since only male could provide for several females as a helper in rearing of their progeny.
Thought more generally. Aquinas taught that non-procreative sex is always unnatural and wrong. And this includes not just homosexuality, but also masturbation and what he calls not observing the natural manner of copulation, in other words, oral or anal sex. And he says that these sins against nature are always worse than things that are mere sins against other persons, because they are sins against the author of nature himself, that is, God. It follows from this that masturbation, which is unnatural, is worse than rape, which is natural. And Aquinas actually says this: masturbation is worse than rape. Now, this obviously is a problem for the view. But the more general problem is that just because procreation is a purpose of sex, it doesn't follow that it's the only legitimate purpose of sex. And besides, the failure to pursue a good, like procreation, isn't the same thing as undermining that good. After all, you're not procreating right now unless you're really good at multitasking. And there are other websites for that kind of thing. And Aquinas himself didn't procreate. He was a Catholic monk. Now, many people have recognized some of the problems in Aquinas' view. And over the last few decades, a group has formed called the New Natural Lawyers. These include people like Robert George at Princeton, John Finnis at Oxford and Notre Dame, Sharif Girgis, Ryan Anderson. Natural lawyer is kind of a funny term. Makes it sound like they practice law on the nude or something. Actually, many of them are philosophers and political theorists, not lawyers per se. But it's worthwhile to understand their view. They reject Aquinas' idea that it's always wrong to act against a biological power like procreation. And so they set up their argument differently. It starts with the notion of basic goods. They're basic in the sense that they're not derived from some more general good like happiness. And among these are things you might expect, like health and knowledge and friendship. And they claim that it's always wrong to act against one of these basic goods. Among their basic goods is something that they call marriage, not in the legal or political sense, but marriage as a two-in-one-flesh union of the husband and wife, a two-in-one-flesh union of the procreative kind. The obvious objection here is, well, what do you do with sterile heterosexual couples? They can't procreate. Think about a woman whose uterus has been removed. She and her husband cannot achieve procreation, and they both know it. So it seems that it would either be wrong for them to have sex, or okay for the gay couple to have sex. But the New Natural Lawyers say, no, even though their sex cannot achieve procreation, it can still be of the procreative kind. But this just stretches the meaning of words. The whole point of calling them a sterile couple is that their sex is not of the procreative kind. The New Natural Lawyers think that sex can be of the procreative kind even when procreation is neither intended nor possible. I think the only way to make sense of a view like this is to focus not on procreation, but on coitus, penis and vagina sex. The New Natural Lawyers think that there's something really morally special about coitus. They say that in coitus, the two become one organism, literally, not metaphorically. Now, put aside the scientific problems with this one organism view. I think the real problem here is that the view mislocates the moral value of coitus. What's morally special about coitus? Well, it can create new life, and morally speaking, that's kind of a big deal. If you're trying to create a baby sexually, then you ought to engage in coitus. But if procreation is neither intended nor possible, then I think you should engage in whatever safe and consensual sexual acts you find mutually fulfilling. If that's coitus, great. If that's oral sex, super. You want to dress in furry costumes and chase each other around the bedroom? Knock yourselves out!
So while concluding, right, Aquinas took a biological premise that sex is for procreation only. He also went further to impose religious and moral constraint. Basically, he concluded that since the primary goal of sex is for procreation, it should only be executed for this manner. However, I am taking the time to emphasize that from a biological and an evolutionary basis, sex is primarily to continue the species and the gene of an organism. However, there are other benefits that lies outside of the sole reproductive function of sex. For example, a knife based on its morphological feature can be used as a screw as a screw rather than just to cut open stuff. These moral constraints set up by the Aquinas arguments and which basically influenced religion and the normative society led to the Bataille effect. The Bataille effect is that modern civilization for several years, once they have some level of prohibition towards something, this can lead to a more erotic behavior or a more desire to want to participate in sexually deviant behavior. I want to emphasize that all the pleasures associated with sex, whether natural or unnatural, is just as a result of an evolutionary adaptation or drive to want to indulge in the sexual activity, even though the nature of the sexual act may not always be procreative. So there's a biological or evolutionary mandate of sex, whereby the biological motive of sex is to produce an offspring with different incentives, meaning different pleasures to encourage the act. This is a biological argument that I am strongly in agreement with. As it relates to philosophical arguments, Immanuel Kant's view on sex both accepts and rejects Aquinas' view that sex is solely for procreation. He believed in the respect for humanity and argues that procreating is wrong if it is done just for he argues that sex is wrong if it's done just for procreating or if it's done just for pleasure. He believed in traditional marriage view by Aquinas though. Bentham and Paley took a more utilitarian view on sex and are opposing both Aquinas and Kant to say that if, for example, casual sex can be morally right once it is not causing any harm. So in this philosophy, an action is morally right if it results in a beneficial consequence than harmful ones. It does not take an unnatural or natural side to sexual practices. It only gives formula to answers. And this is a limitation because societies and cultures worldwide may accept and reject different moral standing. It depends on where you are. So as it relates to Day, which is a radical philosopher who believed in unlimited sexual freedom with no restraints or restriction. He justifies premarital sex, homosexuality, adultery, fornication, and is even for abortion. He believed that humans are naturally polygamous and that it is only social conventions that forces us into monogamous marriages. Goldman believed in personal freedom with responsibility. He rejects Aquinas' argument that sex is only for procreation. He believed that pleasures are all ends in themselves, irrespective of the biological functions they perform. However, unlike these today, views of moral limits to sexual activities. Coleman argues that there are clear restrictions. We cannot harm or manipulate or deceive people. He believes that sex is a moral act unlike these today.